You're looking here at the Western Front cutout for Storm of Steel, which is just going to be a temporary backdrop while I explain a few of the processes of this game. It's by request from a friend of YouTube who's asked me to detail a bit about the diplomacy, the economy, the movement and the combat of the game in a bit more detail. So you might be able to pick it up from gameplay and my sort of general long extensive ramblings in other videos, but this is meant to be a concise video of those sections of the game. So first up, diplomacy. Diplomacy is handled in effect in three ways in this game. So the first is kind of passively, and that is by predetermined events. You can play the game this way as you wish, which is, for example, the Ottomans will join the Central Powers in autumn of 1914, the Italians in spring of 1915, the Bulgarians will come in autumn, Romanians will come in autumn of 1916, and this denotes the earliest US entry, but that's going further. Oh, and the Greece will join the Entente in spring of 1916. So you can play those powers just passively like that, or you can take it to the next way, which is by direct card play. And well, actually the next two ways determined by card play, and there's sort of two things that can happen with that. One is kind of quite directed and the other is a bit more background. Let me explain perhaps the background ones first. So for example, the game has a number of tables. At the end of every turn you roll the political events table for each side. Now, depending on certain situations, you could roll revolution, or you could roll crusade, or you might roll what's called friction. Now, friction can just be things like a colonial uprising. It could be an epidemic that's not really political, but you see the kind of the link, or it could be a general strike. It could be a nationalist uprising, and so on. Or if you roll on the crusade, you might have workers mobilise, volunteers come to the front, there's a war fever, someone stabs you in the back, perhaps another nation that not otherwise in the game, you lose 5 points morale. Or if you roll on the revolution table, there's either going to be a nationalist revolution or a red terror, which will basically mean that you have to roll for each country if you get revolution result at the political events. And depending on certain modifiers, there's a chance of a nationalist or communist revolution in a country. So in that political events which happen every turn, you get either kind of minor political events occurring or major revolutions, and that will happen when certain nations are like on the rocks. For example, their capital has been captured. So that's a kind of like a sort of background that is always going on. It's something you have to watch, and some of it's just completely random. You might on this table get nothing happening, or you might get a sort of a lower just anti-war demonstrations, or it might be such a bad thing as a nationalist uprising, which means you would mobilise nationalist units within that country. But you actually get to control. So you would control the nationalists in an enemy country. So yeah, for example, Austro-Hungary, if I was the Entente, I would put some nationalists in Austro-Hungary and have them fight against their regular forces. So that's kind of the background diplomacy. Then the other diplomacy is by card play, and you can play one of these cards each turn. If you're not developing weapons and or tactics, you will play generally some kind of diplomatic card. For example, there's peace negotiations. If you think you're losing, or if you think your opponent thinks he's losing, you might offer peace negotiations, which will end the game. Then you'll check victory conditions. Then you might be checking for the Americas situation. Now, that can bring America into the game. You can only start from 1917 and on, and as the Central Powers, you have a card to kind of counter that could make the Americas situation worse. So you want to start playing that to try and bring them in at a certain point. You also, both sides have a minor powers. No, that's not true. The Allied side has a minor powers card. They can play this, and they would roll on the minor powers table, and it might bring in minor powers off map. For example, Japan. There's Dutch force off map, but Brazil, Portugal, and Spain. And so it's not many units, sort of one or two of each. But it can bring some extra units into the game for you. So, those countries would send their expeditionary forces. And then finally, sort of the major diplomatic operations that you're going to be playing cards for, apart from bringing America in at a certain point, are called diplomacy or ultimatum. And these are ways of bringing in on-map nations onto your side while pushing them over to the enemy side. So with the diplomacy cards, you will play it against, so for example, the Central Powers might look at Bulgaria and say, we want Bulgaria on our side. We will play the diplomacy card. You will check the table and certain modifications and see if you were successful that season. If not, you can try again another time or with another nation. And the modifiers are, if that country is kind of more friendly towards you or less friendly, and how your morale is doing, are you doing well in the war and so forth. Then there is an alternative to that, which is called the ultimatum card. And with that one, essentially, you will put your troops on the border of a neutral country. And then if you have twice as many troops as they do in the country, you get a bonus modifier. You will roll the die, and either they come on your side, or they will it will push them over to the enemy side. But either way, it means that they're no longer a neutral country. You can enter and do what you will with them. And in effect, that's how the game deals with the German entry into Belgium. That would be cast as a play of an ultimatum card on the first turn, with a very, I think, I haven't checked the modifiers again recently, but I think a very slight chance that Belgium would come over to your side. And so, effectively allow you to march through their country, but generally they're just going to go over to the Entente side and you will march in and attack them. So that is how, excuse me, diplomacy works in the game. And also to say, I've sort of combined, you've got the passive play, so the Ottomans joined, etc. But I also chose, I'm waiting for Bulgaria to join the Central Powers, but they actually played a diplomacy card to try and bring Bulgaria in early. They were unsuccessful, but I think you can combine those two in that way. So you've got the kind of the fixed diplomatic events. You can have them optional, so you could require a diplomacy card to bring any and all of those in. So it was purely on your initiative and a slight bit of luck. You've got the background events that are happening every turn, more or less, better or worse ones, and then you've got the very proactive events, which you're going to choose one of these cards every turn or so when you're not developing weapons and tactics. Try and affect something important for your side. So that is how diplomacy plays. Now, what about economy? Well, it happens in two ways. The fairly standard way which we get in war games. You have a mobilization sheet, so these are all units that you can buy into the game, ranging from headquarters, various kinds of infantry, cavalry, shock, etc., alpine, some tank stuff, artillery, armoured trains, fortifications, air units, 2 types, naval units, about 8 types. You can motorise some units. You buy poison gas attacks that have. You can buy political warfare agents, guerrillas. No, sorry, you don't buy guerrillas. They come in via card play. and you also spend money to move devastation markers. Devastation might occur according to psychological warfare, so-called. So that's when there's a phase where you use secret agents to perform various activities, including devastating a hex. And you can also choose to devastate a hex yourself. You probably wouldn't, because you're probably going to want the industrial point, the petroleum, or perhaps use a naval base. Perhaps you might not. You might well want to just destroy a naval base. And also you can pay to convert railroads to your gauge and for use of your stock, etc. And how do you pay for that? Well, the game, if you don't have the second edition of the game, which comes with a very nice CD with tons of extra player aids designed by Robert Medro, I think is his name, you can get them off the Decision Games website for free. You'll get something like this. This is the industrial city ownership display. So every industrial city is marked on the map. You can probably just about make out these sort of pink areas. They're pinky red areas, which are industrial cities. A lot in that region you just saw there, but not so much in other countries. So, for example, these are the Entente ones. So this is all in France. These are neutral nations ones. This is Germany's. That's Austro-Hungary's. Those are the meagre ones belonging to Russia, Italy, the Ottomans, etc., etc., etc. There's also a few off-map for which you will need transport, naval units to transport that. You need a line of communications from these back to your home country, like Great Britain or France or whatever. It's all done per nation. So what you essentially do is you add up the number. So this is handy if an enemy force has captured. So say if the Entente capture Osnabrück, then you can note that that's now in their possession. And you also have petroleum down here. Now petroleum is just needed to build tank units, air units, and some of the naval units like naval flotillas and battleship squadrons, and also motorization markers. And essentially what you do is you check each turn. Each turn has a, can you see that? Sorry about the bad light. Has a production multiple. So for example, we start at ×4 for the whole of 1914. It goes up to ×6, rising to ×8 at the end of 1915, and the highest is ×8, and then it goes down towards the end of the war to ×4 again. Russia has it a bit rougher. They have ×4 generally, but they bang up to ×12 for 3 seasons and then go back down to ×4. So they have a quick spurt in the middle there, but generally it's kind of a weaker industry. Then another thing you need, one of Bob Medro's, you don't need this, but this is such a boon, is you get your production sheet. So he's laid this out. So you note your petroleum hexes, any mobilization points from previous turn, and then on-map mobilization centers. He called them mobilization centers. They're actually strictly, I mean, industrial cities are where you mobilize your new troops, so that's where they will land once you've built them. But industrial centres, so for example, England starts with 14 at the multiple of 4, so they get 56 on the first turn. They also have off-map 1, 4 off-map 1, 16 if they had enough transport. I actually made a mistake there. They don't begin with enough transportation to bring all that on, so I've had to make some adjustments. But anyway, you get the picture. Then you can capture mobilisation centres. You get half the multiplier, so when the multiplier goes up to 8, it becomes ×4. Then you have your subtotal. Then you can send some mobilization points to allies, 10% of yours, you total yours, and then you run down through the costs. So the costs are just for the costs from the mobilization chart there, helpfully summarized here. So for example, an infantry division costs 8 mobilization points, and it will take 2 months. So if we're building it in spring, which happens at the end of the spring turn. The infantry divisions will be available in autumn, and again that's at the end of the term in autumn of 1915. 2 months to build. Now you have to note that this is cost per division, and the smallest units on the map are corps and 2 division corps. So to bring on a unit, it would actually cost you 60 mobilization points. That gives you some idea of the general cost at the start. That's like a third or a quarter of your starting quota, give or take. You also have the reserves, shot, etc. So bang, 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 and some of them, these ones that after the slash shows how many petroleum points it requires to build them. And so you have one of these handy sheets for every nation, every season, in every year. Thank you. Bob Medra is a godsend to this game, and it really should have been produced with it and also with these others. But I guess they were saving costs. It's an expensive game. They just had to save costs somewhere. Another thing to note with that is that you have merchant shipping index, which can be brought down by the central powers, and then that can cause hits to your industrial points stroke mobilization points that you have available as they put units in the commerce raiding box. And then contrary to that, the Entente can play a blockade card. They should probably do that quite early in the game. It's going to cost them some industry to get going, but then every turn the central powers are going to lose 1d6 in morale. Oh yeah, sorry, I said that the shipping index makes you lose industry points. It doesn't, in fact. It makes you lose morale, but if it goes down really low or you're a bit unlucky, it can result in an industrial collapse whereby the British only get 50% of their industry capacity on that quarter, so it will affect your industry in that respect, not as a sort of a regular cost. So I think that's plain. You count up your industrial centres, you perform your multiples and so forth, any gifts from allies, any subtract anything you're sending to allies. Then you do your buys, and then you put your units on the certain amount of turns ahead on the track available for next for that turn. One thing notable in this is that you can you get reserve corps. They're never as strong as the regular infantry, but they come on straight away. So the turn you buy them is the turn you put them on the map. So they're available the next turn for operations, defence, and so forth. And essentially, those sort of units can come on places within supply with a line of communication, even in an enemy zone of control. So if you've got a front line city that is being attacked from one side by the enemy, you can funnel in reserves immediately and infantry in time through the other side. So that is how economy works. Probably one more thing on that line to mention is the I don't know what that's doing there. Is the secret agents. So you actually buy them with morale points rather than mobilization stroke industry points, but they can have effects upon enemy economy and or morale. So they could cause sabotage, devastation, or they can reduce morale. Morale doesn't affect your economy other than via the it doesn't affect your economy. Those sort of operate independently, although they're going to both go down together because your morale goes down, for example, when you lose industrial cities. So that brings me to movement and combat. So back here to the Western Front. Let's zoom in a bit. Now we just had a joyful moment in the last turn. The Entente, the French, they managed to destroy a fortification there with their siege artillery. They can immediately attack after that. They attacked, so there's 2 entrenched corps there, 60 defence points. They attacked with something like 60, but they also had a card, which meant they had a bonus. had played a campaign card. So it was a risky attack. Joy they caused a bloodbath. It doesn't sound great, does it? But essentially what that means is that the side with fewer combat strength, which was the enemy, they lost all of theirs in the equal amount. So each side was drained of 60 strength points. Now it sounds high, but when you're entrenched, which these were, you're doubled. So they only actually lost 2 core, and the French had to lose about 4 core because they're attacking, so they're not doubled. But they had enough units, so now that they've opened up a hole in the... this is Luxembourg, so they couldn't have gone through that. It's a neutral nation. I don't think there's any chance of putting an ultimatum on Luxembourg, actually. Well, that's an interesting question. They don't have any units, so but anyway, so the French can now move through here. How do you move? Well, every unit has where's my tweezers gone? I lost my tweezers, and I borrowed another from my son, sort of from the toy tweezers. They're a bit bulky. So the French, you can see they've got headquarters all on its own there, and denuded long way of troops in that attack, and again that fortification. But the point is that say they now want to move, you would look at the movement number, which is 2. Let's come down even closer. It's the number on the far right at the bottom. So and generally that's how far units move, is 2 movement points. Cavalry 3. Haven't got to the tanks and that yet, but I think that's going to be 3, because you can motorise infantry, but then they only move 1 extra movement point. And it's your normal thing, so it's movement generally costs 1 or 2, and there's a few prohibited hexes, +1 for going over a river, that kind of thing. So that would be into a city. That is actually going to be 1 movement point. Because he's in a zone of control, has to stop. If he was here, he could go 1 and then 2, 1. It would cost 2 to go in there, so he couldn't. So you see, movement is quite slow. Now, the other point to note is that if you are entrenched, as the Germans over here are, they don't have a movement rating. They have E for entrenched. So at the beginning of your impulse, or is it the whole turn? I can't remember now. You have to decide, are you entrenched, in which case you will not be moving that season, or are you performing operations, in which case you can. But you see, these ones are worth 15 when they are mobile on the combat strength. And the other point to note is about movement. It's just really standard. The first thing I think to note is it's quite slow, as befits the scale and First World War. The other thing is the advance after combat table. Now, you saw these units, they have a middle rating. Headquarters have 3. These, that one is entrenched. Say this mobile unit here has 3 in the middle, which is the cadre rating. Now that determines some bonus in advance after combat. These are at the top. You have combat results. Let's zoom out a little bit. I didn't mean to go that far. Sorry, my zoom's tricky. Okay. So you check your cadre level on the side. So if we're 3, we can, as a defender, we can actually, these results are against the attacker, we can actually advance after combat as the defender. Otherwise, as the attacker, we would need defender retreat, half exchange, defender destroyed, defender attrition, or defender eliminated, defender defeated, sorry, not destroyed, or defender eliminated results. And if for example, defender attrition is you lose 1 unit and the rest retreat. So we could advance 1 hex. If we actually completely eliminated them at cadre level of 3, we could advance 2 hexes, and that's ignoring zones of control. Now that comes in especially handy later when you get 4 cadre units, which are the shock troops. So you can see, that DI result is actually defender infiltrated. Defender eliminated would be DE, the same as defender attrition. So normally you would only get so on the sorry, I'm not explaining it well, but I haven't actually used the infiltration table yet, at least this game. You can't use it versus fortifications and so forth, but shock or tank units must be attacking, and so you can infiltrate further depending on the result that you get and the Kaja level of your troops. So I think that's all we have to say about movement, which actually did seek us into attack, didn't it? And I think the main point of that is these combat tables. Just to say that movement for the naval units is just basically AC, or anywhere within friendly waters on the main map. And if units, so if you don't end a sea unit in a port, you need a transport, or else they might suffer from attrition, which means they're eliminated on a die roll of 1 or 2 at the end of the turn. Friendly land units generally only are eliminated on a 1. It goes up in winter if they're out of supply. And air units just have, there's not that many in the game, they just have a range of operation. They're based on the map, and you choose what kind of operation you're performing, whether it's reconnaissance or perhaps ground support within their range. Okay, so with combat, essentially you have 3 types of combat table, and there might actually be a 4th in the 2nd edition, which I read about, a mobile combat table, which I don't have unless they change the name. You have on here, you have probe combat, assault combat, and infiltration combat. Well, we saw infiltration requires shock or tank units. Assault combat has to be done against fortified zones, industrial cities, and navy bases. Otherwise, it's your choice whether you go for a probe or an assault. An assault, it could result in bloodbaths. It's more likely detrimental to the attacker as well as to the defender. So you could get, you might lose a lot of units. For example, if we look at the 3-to-1 column, a third of the time you're going to get a bloodbath, which I described, where the side of the fewer units loses all of them, then the other side has to eliminate the same strength points. So, you know, if you're 2-to-1, you wouldn't be too bad, but if you're rough parity, if you're at 3-to-1, you're obviously the attacker's going to lose a third, the defender loses everything. Half exchange is all defender units are eliminated, the attacker removes half of that defender's combat strength, so it's like a weaker bloodbath. DD is defender defeated, so half of the defender's units are eliminated, the rest retreat. So a third of the time the attacker is going to lose units at 3-to-1, a third of the time only the defender, and they will retreat. Going all the way up to, you also get defender attrition, so the defender would just lose 1 unit, not half. You might get both attrition, you might get attacker attrition, attacker defeated, or you might get the normal retreat table. But no, on the assault combat there's no retreat, no attack retreat and no defender retreat. It just runs from elimination, defeat, attrition to bloodbath, anything in between. So if you're wanting just retreats, you would go to the probe table, and at 3-to-1, a third of the time nothing happens. Then on the 3, 4, 5, the defender would retreat, and on the 6th they would retreat and they would lose 1 unit. So you could see it's not bloody, but it's a probe, so you're trying to sort of push the enemy away, or just have a look and see. You don't really mind if there's no result, but you get to see who's in that stack. So the highest result you can get is defender attrition, which is where they lose 1 unit, and the worst is attacker defeat, where you'd actually lose half of your units. So that is combat, land combat, but I should also bring the other forms of combat. For example, the novel poisoned gas table. So you roll a d6, there's some modifiers that have a backfire, no effect, effective or very effective. So note the first use of it in the game is a +2 modifier, so first use could be quite interesting for you. If it results in a backfire, you're going to eliminate one of your own units randomly. Effective, you would retreat or unentrench. So if they were unentrenched, they would go down to that mobile attack combat strength rather than their double entrenched defense strength. So that's going to be good. Or if the hex contains a city, the defender gains 2 morale points. Outrage over attacks on civilians. So that's a bonus for your the person you're attacking. Very effective. It has a similar, but they would actually retreat. But in that case, the defender actually loses 5 morale points because you gassed population of the city, and they weren't just outraged; they were completely demoralised. Then naval combat. Just briefly, you have a contact table, so you have to gain contact. It's not a certain thing, and that table also depends who fires first, or if you're firing at each other simultaneously. Then you add up your factors, you roll on the table, and it can be not very much or very bloody. And naval units can also try and bombard enemy coastal cities and or fortresses, and that can again either reduce enemy morale or add to enemy morale. They're either outraged or demoralised, as well as eliminating fortresses in the hex. What else? And yes, and then there's the air table. So air has they can fight each other for air superiority, or they have also, you might later in the war develop crude air bombing attacks. And so with that you can you could lower enemy morale by -1, that's not much, or you might devastate a city hex. You can even perform air against naval units if you have reached air doctrine level of 5. That's only if you've developed every year up to 1918 and been lucky each time on the die roll. So it's not likely, but it could happen. I should also say that there's one of the cards, I think a contingency card, is like a Zeppelin attack. So that kind of thing is not simulated via tables and units, but by odd cards. There's also offensives, Jutland offensives and so forth. And then finally there is the psychological warfare table. I mentioned that before, but essentially you choose between propaganda, subversion, espionage or sabotage. Sabotage can delay enemy production or cause devastation of an industrial city. Subversion can allow you to look at enemy units or cause morale changes. Espionage can be great. It can let you look at the enemy's strategy card choice before you choose yours, which is really valuable when you consider that if your enemy plays a card which gives him 2 or 3 extra impulses on a front, that's like he might get 2 or 3, or even 3 or 4 turns, whereas you might be getting 1 if you didn't play a card. So if you know that, you're going to make sure you're going to play a card probably, or to do something else to balance that. And then also propaganda, that's just changing morale rolls either way depending on the result. So I think that's it. I hope I covered everything necessary, and again, if there's anything else, please do let me know. Oh, and I should just mention there is in combat there's a weather chart, so depending on the season you'll get different shifts and different theatres on your combat rolls, which sets the tempo of the game quite a bit, because for example in spring in winter everyone gets a shift, and it's double shift in the east. In spring you still get a shift in the east, but not on the other two fronts. In summer it's great and balmy in the west and the east, but in the Middle East you actually get a detrimental shift. So you don't want to be campaigning in winter and summer in the Middle East, but you don't want to campaign in winter anywhere. And you actually get a shift in the east in autumn, so you don't want to campaign at any time except summer in the east. And go figure, I chose the warring for the Central Powers to try and take St. Petersburg. So they're trying to campaign throughout the whole year, battling the weather as well as their enemy. That's it.